Vodka martini. Shaken, not stirred.
Nope, we're not talking about 007 or martinis. I'm not going to bore you with the acronyms, but I'll tell you, someone had to have been drinking when they came up with that acronym. On a serious note, what is stir shaken and why should I care? In 2019, Congress passed and the president signed into law the TRACE Act, the Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Basically a law mandating that carriers implement robocall mitigation practices, penalties, and a way to trace back bad actors. One such robocall mitigation practice being implemented is stir shaken by June 30th, 2021. I mean, look, people are sick of illegal number spoofing and something had to be done. So carriers using this process and technology will allow phone subscribers to identify illegally spoofed phone numbers and a mechanism for the government to trace back where these calls came from. Hopefully at that point, hold accountable the people that allowed those calls into the network and the people making those calls. This is all good for consumers, but how does this impact businesses that make outbound calls? I mean, any company that makes any type of outbound call. If you make outbound calls and you don't have your calls signed, at some point it's possible your calls could get flagged negatively or outright blocked and sent to voicemail. As the adoption of this technology increases, we will begin to see how it impacts your calls. The best advice I can give anyone is to fully understand what attestation is and understanding what level of attestation your calls will receive in a variety of use cases. Now that I've either scared you or told you something you already knew, let's clarify some things around attestation. Hopefully, some of this will help protect your business. Most people who do have an idea of what stir shaken is normally ask and require that their providers give them an A-level attestation or full attestation. Okay, well, what does that even mean? Well, there's 3 levels of attestation, A, B, and C. We're really going to focus on A since this is where most of the misconceptions and requests come from. A attestation or full attestation is something really simple. It means that the relationship of you and your provider is a direct relationship. You know who each other are. The second part is that the service provider knows that the numbers you're using, you have permission to use. Well, that sounds easy, right? Well, it depends on a few things. So let's talk about a few scenarios that your business may run into that are quite normal, but it could impact the level of attestation you get. Let's say that you have multiple telecom carriers that deliver your calls. It's very common for a variety of reasons: reliability, cost diversity. Maybe you've moved into the cloud and you use a UCaaS or CCaaS platform where they're the ones who manage the telecom for you. Unless you have a situation where you can bring your own carrier. Maybe you're an outsourcer and you're making calls on behalf of somebody else. Lastly, you could be making calls with numbers your clients own. These all seem like reasonable and normal business practices. You may be saying, well, how could this impact my calls and especially my level of attestation? Well, first, let's figure out who owns the part of attesting and signing the calls. Your service provider is the one who gets to decide what level of attestation your calls get. You actually really don't have a say into what happens here, because it's the service provider who has a legal obligation to make sure that the level of attestation they give complies with the rules. So unless you really want to become a service provider yourself and sign your own calls, you really have a couple scenarios like the ones outlined that could impact your level of attestation. Let's dive into that. For example, what happens when you use numbers you have with one carrier and then you end up making calls through another carrier? Well, if you haven't talked to your carriers to find out what happens to your level of attestation in those scenarios, you should do so. Please don't assume that because each of your providers have the ability to sign calls, the A-level attestation will magically happen with anything you do, regardless of what number you use, especially numbers that you didn't get from that carrier. Some carriers may require you to have a direct relationship and to get the numbers from them to get A-level attestation. Some providers may have an internal process that allows them to confirm to their satisfaction you have permission to use a number that they didn't get from you and yet still give you A-level attestation. It is up to each service provider to decide on their internal process. You really have to look into anything that could impact your attestation and make sure you understand how it could be an impact. If you use numbers your client provided for you, which you don't own, which is something, if you're an outsourcer, is quite common, you'll have to ask your provider exactly what happens to your calls if you're using numbers that you don't own but have permission to use. Let's talk about the case where things go wrong. Guess what? Nothing's perfect. Things happen. Outages, quality issues. Sometimes you have to reroute traffic to another provider. Well, if you have a backup carrier, find out from that backup carrier what happens to your attestation if you use numbers on them that you got from a different provider when something's going wrong. If that carrier was not going to give you A-level attestation, it's important that you look at what alternatives you have to continue to have A-level attestation. One suggestion I give clients is get some backup phone numbers from that backup carrier. Just in case you can use alternative numbers, now you have another way to get A-level attestation while you're in a position where the backup carrier needs to be used. A lot of companies, as you know, have moved to the cloud. You may be one of them, using a CCaaS or UCaaS provider that manages the carrier relationship for you and the software. It's an all-in-one solution, makes it very convenient, which is great. But one scenario you have to remember is unless you brought your own carrier, you don't have a direct relationship anymore with a carrier. So you need to make sure that either your UCaaS or CCaaS provider is the one signing the calls, and they can continue to give you the level of attestation that can be provided based on the numbers you're using and the relationship you have. If they've delegated it to another provider to do the signing and attestation, then you need to make sure that if something were to go wrong, what happens when they move traffic to another carrier? Also, what happens when you use numbers not provided by your provider? How does that impact your attestation? We've covered a lot of the most common challenges related to getting A-level attestation and some questions you can ask your providers. One major misconception that we really need to end with is understanding how labeling and blocking of your calls is impacted when it comes to STIR/SHAKEN. The short answer is because your calls are getting signed or even attested to A-level does not mean that your current or future mislabeling of calls as fraud or scam or spam will magically go away. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. They live in two separate worlds. Even though they do interact in some ways with one another, they do not live and depend on one another to exist. If you're today getting calls that are labeled or blocked, that really has more to do with your calling behavior, your number management practices, and of course, how people perceive your calls and the complaints you get. If you have questions around anything I discussed today, whether it's STIR/SHAKEN, attestation levels, understanding how it may or may not impact you, and of course, if you're currently getting your calls mislabeled or you see contact rates drop, please reach out. NobelBiz is here to help. Feel free to reach out via email, call, web chat, LinkedIn, any way you can get a hold of us. We'll definitely make sure to get you with the right experts and get you where you need to be.